So in this next interview, I interviewed Chris Magwood in his home, and it was a really great interview, and I had an incredible number of insights that I wanted to just share with you just before you get into the interview, because it's fairly long. It's about 60 minutes. But I thought I would kind of hit some of the highlights in this intro reel here, and I made a few notes because there's so many insights from this interview that I did with Chris. And so Chris is kind of a brother from another mother in a sense, and because him and I think similarly about different domains. So he calls himself a building omnivore, a sustainable building omnivore, and I kind of feel the same way about permaculture. And so I approach permaculture design without dogma, and so I look at all of the possibilities that live within that space, and I try to approach it without judgment, and then look at the different options that exist with regards to the bioregion that we're currently designing. And so an example of that would be that keyline might be very applicable in some ecosystems and not at all applicable in others, or swales might work really well in a cold climate but not work well in a dry climate, or whatever. I mean, every system would have to be assessed through a series of lenses. And so Chris does this with buildings, and so he looks at sustainable products but is not dogmatic about hempcrete or straw or anything for that matter. It has to meet his sustainability criteria, and he has a whole list of things that he'll look at in order to determine whether it does that or not. And so I like that he's open-minded and willing to experiment with different products and try different things in his buildings, which is what makes him such an interesting guy to learn from, because you go to him and he'll never give you a straight answer on anything, because it always depends on the context, on the goals, on the client, on the bioregion. But you know that you're going to get a good answer when you ask him one of these questions, because he's thinking about it without getting into that kind of level of dogma, essentially. So I really like that, and you're going to get that out of this interview. His latest kind of shtick, if you will, and he even states that he wishes that he didn't have to only think about this, except that he's noticed that it's made a really big difference in a lot of the decisions that he's made, is that when you look at sustainability through the lens of carbon, you end up inevitably choosing plant-based materials to build your buildings out of, plant or animal, thinking like wool as an example, which ends up being better from a carbon sequestration perspective. But ironically, according to him and in this interview, he talks about how it ends up improving all of the categories within the building. So red list chemicals, sustainability, breathability, everything. So he goes into quite a bit of detail about plant-based materials and their carbon sequestering capability. Ultimately, one of the things that's super hopeful about that whole concept around plant-based buildings is that in the US alone, they produce roughly 2 billion tons of biomass per year as a result of their agricultural industries. And what's nuts about that number, 2 billion, is it represents the same amount of emissions that are emitted globally for all of our transportation needs. And so while we're looking for all of these solutions to sequester carbon all over the world, we've literally got the answer right underneath our feet. Hopefully we can do it without the use of industrial agriculture, because that, as you know if you've been watching this channel, causes all sorts of other liabilities. But at the very least, it gives us a clue with regards to where those solutions might be held, which is essentially in the plant kingdom, with partnering with our photosynthesis buddies, our plants and trees and shrubs and everything else. So have a look at the interview. I'd love to know what your comments are on it. I'll make sure that I leave a link to all of Chris's books in the show notes below, as well as to the Endeavour Centre website. And who knows, maybe we'll end up interviewing Chris again in the future. If you haven't seen his interview on sustainable home design, I'll leave a link to it in the card right here. At the end of the video, I'll do a quick wrap-up. And I hope you guys really enjoy the interview. I know I sure did.
Hi, I'm Chris Magwood from the Endeavour Centre, and it's a sustainable building school here in Peterborough, Ontario that we've been running for the past 8 years, teaching people how to do sustainable design and construction methods for housing and commercial buildings. 25-ish years ago, my partner at the time and I decided that we wanted to sort of simplify our lives and decided to move out to the country, build a house, try to do a no mortgage, fairly independent living type thing. And so we knew an energy efficient house and a house that we could actually build was going to be a big part of that. And we spent a couple years looking around. This is sort of pre-internet or there being lots of this kind of information on the internet. So finding books, reading books, connecting with other people who had done that kind of thing. And we kept coming across building systems that were exciting when we heard about them and then got less and less exciting as we learned more about it. You start to hear the drawbacks and kind of like think it through and wonder if that was the thing. And I was actually getting fairly discouraged about like, how are we going to do this thing? This notion that we wanted to do better, both environmentally and in terms of energy efficiency than what we knew was out there, but we didn't know what that meant. And so by sort of chance, somebody gave me a copy of the first Straw Bale House book that came out in, I think, 96. And I literally bought it as a joke to take home to Julie because we'd seen so many ideas and it was a total tongue-in-cheek, like, we've looked at everything, so haha, like, let's also look at Straw Bale. And interestingly, it was the first book that we started out skeptical, but our questions got answered better than we had found in other ones. Like, it was an idea that we were not enamored with initially, but it started to make more sense the more we looked into it. And so we ended up building the first permitted straw bale house in Ontario. And that was not intended to be a career move for me, but I really loved building that house, through all the ups and downs, and literally making every mistake that it's possible to make in doing a house. And in particular, kind of seeing this material that I'd read this one book about, and that as we were building with it, realizing there were so many better things we could have done, if we'd planned differently and sort of designed differently. And even in the construction, having finished a phase of the construction, realizing, like, the real way to do this would have been, another approach. And so I had an interest in, I would love to do this better next time, not thinking there was going to be a next time for me, but then kind of simultaneous with building that house, people who are also interested in this kind of housing just started showing up and asking questions and wanting to know how it went for us. And that kind of led to people like, well, hey, you've done this, would you teach a workshop here? Would you come and help me with my build? And, literally within a year and a half, that's what I was doing full time. So it kind of arose fairly, naturally, and was not a sort of intentional career move, but that was 25 years ago, and that's really all I've done since. I was a freelance writer for the most part and really enjoyed that. But in order to make a living in a sort of, living in the city typical scenario was taking on a lot of work that I didn't like for clients that I didn't feel supportive of, but I needed to pay those bills. And so our transition to this straw bale house was an attempt to, simplify a lifestyle so that we could take on the writing jobs that we wanted to have and sort of turn down the ones that we were doing just because we needed that income to pay the utility bills and cover rental payments or mortgage payments. Our first straw bale house I would classify as a beautiful mistake. Like I said, we made pretty much every mistake it's possible to make in both the designing of and building of that house, but I think due to our own passion to make sure that it in the end worked well, we made it work. And so we ended up with a better finished product than it should have been, if we had been different people approaching it differently. So we kind of loved it into, being a really great functional house, and, raised a family there and, built a life there. And it was a great place to experiment, because we did manage to build it for not, we didn't have a mortgage on it, we didn't have payments over our heads, which freed up a lot of time. So I was able to build a solar hot water system, add a micro hydro system to the place, start, one day I want to learn about hempcrete, so I built a hempcrete porch on the back of the house. Like it was one of those places where there was just sort of no fear or no reason to not experiment. And some of the experiments were completely out of necessity. Like we built quite far back off the road because there was a nice spot on the property, without considering the fact that it was going to cost a fortune to bring the electricity grid back that far. So we ended up learning how to live off grid, which was never even one of the original intentions. We sort of like backed ourselves into not being able to access grid power, and so then having to figure out what to do. And even that was a really interesting process, because we went from having not enough money to do any kind of power. So we lived there for 2 years with no electricity, and a 2-year-old, and we're really shocked at how great that lifestyle was. Like it actually we didn't feel particularly limited or deprived or anything like that. And so that gave us an approach to renewable energy, which was, hey, wouldn't it be really nice to have an electric light to read by at night? The kerosene lamps were great for everything else, but nighttime reading would be really nice to. And so we were able to sort of build a renewable energy system based on actual need, and sort of then respond to, is this enough to run 6 lights? And it was enough to run 6 lights and a laptop computer. And if we added another panel and another car battery, suddenly we could expand to this. And so it kind of grew in a way where I got to learn very directly how much output equals, or how much input gets you how much output. And so it was just the whole experience was such a tremendous learning experience, because there was a sort of like personal need to figure this stuff out, and to be aware of the budget when I was doing that. Like all the things that sometimes as a professional builder you don't get to do. Like you don't get to size something a little bit small to see how it plays out, because a client isn't going to like that. But when it's for you, you can do that. I could build my own solar hot water collector and learn through 2 or 3 iterations the best way to do that, because it didn't matter that much if it failed. All I did was like learn how to do it better the next time. So it was as a builder, or as somebody who turned into a builder, it was such a great opportunity to like learn via mistakes that weren't a liability for a client. They were my own to fix, and then the knowledge that came out of the fix was invaluable that way. To date, I've been the direct builder on probably about 30, mostly residential buildings, but also a fair number of public assembly and commercial buildings. And then in terms of involvement in sort of the design or the consultation, or being a subcontractor for certain parts of those, probably that many again. Yeah. Over the 60 odd buildings that I've been involved with, I've kind of come to consider myself what I call a sustainable building omnivore. I'm not particularly attached to one set of materials or one set of techniques. I really like thinking about the particular needs of that particular client and building, and seeing what is appropriate, in that scenario. So, we've done everything from really conventional, say, concrete foundations, through to super experimental, earth bag foundations with used carpet insulation. We've used pier foundations, Duracell block foundations. Like, really what keeps me enthusiastic as a builder is trying new stuff and figuring out, what are its strengths and weaknesses, and then learning where are those best applied on future projects. So, I think with wall systems, we've probably tried everything that's out there, from conventional stuff like dense packed cellulose to straw bale to hempcrete to mycelium insulation, and if it's got the right practical characteristics for that building, then I'm open to trying it. So been pretty wide ranging in what we've been able to work with. I'm most excited about plant-based materials, in whatever form is appropriate. That's, my go-to is to figure out, is there a plant-based option? And then out of the plant-based options, is there a plant-based option where that plant is local? That would sort of be, the top of the list. So, we do a lot with hempcrete, but there are a lot of places right now where hemp isn't grown, and so that's not the pathway. We do a lot with straw bale, but there are a lot of places where the straw isn't locally available, so that's not the pathway. Something as simple as cellulose insulation, which is ground up recycled newspaper, which is plant fiber in a sort of waste stream form. Sometimes that's appropriate because we can go to a big box store and buy that stuff nearby. So yeah, we're always just sort of trying to balance the budget with the practicality with the the other sort of ecological implications of those materials. But there's a surprisingly wide palette out there, so we're not really limited. It's more trying to hone in on what's specifically appropriate for that particular project.
But actually, it's not just plant-based materials, because you're open to using things like wool too.
Sure, sheep's wool is, yeah. And I mean, the other day we were watching some video about chickens getting plucked. I started thinking, industrial chicken factories, like, where do those feathers go? Because that's amazing insulation. Like, is there a market for those? Are they going somewhere, or are they just getting landfilled or something like that? But yeah, I mean, I think all around there's byproducts are everywhere, and those are all opportunities that haven't been fully explored for buildings. Yeah, ground up used textiles, that's a massive potential for building insulation. Well, my master's is focused on opportunities for basically carbon capture and storage in building materials, which is kind of the academic speak that I could come up with for saying building with plants. If you start exploring the world of carbon capture and storage, everybody right now, or people in that field, are frantically trying to invent the machine that will kind of pull all this excess CO2 out of the atmosphere and turn it into something that we can either store or use. And the fact is the plants do that already. Like, they are these incredible carbon capture and storage machines, and we grow intentionally so much plant material every year that has a lot of leftover. So just in grain straw, we grow about 2 billion tons of straw to get the seed off the top of these grains, and there's as much carbon stored in those straws as all our transportation emissions combined on the planet. So already there are carbon capture and storage machines that we're going out into a field, we're planting, we're sort of encouraging them to grow, we're harvesting them, and then like either burning them or just letting them molder in a field. Like, we're not sort of taking that, but literally if we could just bundle up that straw and get it in buildings, we could offset all these emissions that are causing problems. And so yeah, my master's thesis is basically looking at not just grain straw, but what are all the opportunities for that kind of carbon capture and storage, whether it's things like waste paper, waste textiles, which are also carbon holding products, and then looking especially at agriculture, like what's the full spectrum of stuff that's out there. There's billions of tons of rice hulls, there's billions of tons of banana leaf, there's billions of tons, like every crop that you look at tends to have all these residues that currently aren't being used in a productive way, and that most of them anyway have a way that they lend themselves quite well to a building material. And so how do we affect that change where that becomes standard practice, that these billions of tons of carbon are stored in buildings instead of just re-released to the atmosphere. In looking at materials through the carbon storage lens, one of the things that has been really exciting about focusing on that as a way of choosing materials, intentionally choosing materials for their ability to store carbon, what also happens is there's this great overlay between the human health implications of building materials, the waste issues of building materials, the performance, like the actual performance of the building, all of those tend to overlay with really great carbon storage. So the good carbon storing materials also, almost across the board, tend to be better for people, have less chemicals in them, have less waste issues, have less end-of-life concerns, and typically create a building that is way better at handling moisture and sort of like performance concerns while the building is operating. And when we look at materials, like we typically look at all of those different things as criteria to make those selections. And what's really interesting is that if we hone in on the carbon storing ones, we kind of get all those other things as co-benefits. Whereas if we hone in on, say, just non-toxic building, it's also possible then to get into materials that, sure, they're non-toxic, but they have waste issues or end-of-life issues or performance issues, or they have a large carbon footprint. But if the lens becomes the carbon storing ones, that has been the best way to sort of like bring in all those other co-benefits at the same time. So I wouldn't want to become that single-minded, like I don't only want to think about carbon, but at this point, by thinking about carbon, I tend to do better in all those other categories too than if I wasn't. I think the application of all of these materials, especially the carbon storing ones, they're all things that could be practically applied to conventional building. And already, one of the most interesting models that came out of the work I'm doing on my thesis is that if a builder chooses to build a sort of code compliant building, not over insulated, not sort of changing any parameters, and just intentionally chooses the materials with the best carbon profile, either the lowest carbon footprint version or carbon storing versions, all those materials already exist to make a carbon neutral building. Like, there's nothing new that needs to be invented, and in fact, not even really any code work that needs to happen. So there's a selection of materials right now that you could just go to the big box store and build your code compliant house out of and do really well in terms of carbon footprint, and then bring all those other benefits. It is less toxic, there is less waste, all those other things that come with it. So on the one hand, we don't need this big breakthrough for that to happen. We actually only need builders or the regulatory structure to say, this is an important reason to make material choices, which right now there's no sort of incentive to make those choices, but really good ones exist right now in the conventional construction palette. So that said, there's ones that are even better that are either currently recognized by code or a lot of work has been done on them, that there are sort of small scale sort of factories and production happening where that stuff isn't accessible to the whole market yet, but it's ready. Like, it's, everything's been done to sort of like test it and prove it and even start small scale production, but it hasn't infiltrated the market. And I think that is going to need some incentive, whether that comes from carbon pricing or building code regulation, or people, the owners of buildings, saying like, hey, builder, designer, make me a building that doesn't have a huge carbon footprint. There's going to have to be some sort of market push to bring this whole range of like awesome ideas, like the mycofoam insulation from Ecovate. It's brilliant stuff. And there's one little factory in New York State turning out very small quantities of it, and it's ready to go, but it's not out there everywhere. So I think there's a really wide range of stuff that's just at the edge of being adoptable, but isn't there yet. And what would be an exciting outcome of my work and everybody who's in this carbon storing space would be to kind of push that, so that all those things people have already figured out and invented make it into the marketplace sort of at a scale that makes a difference. I think right now, unfortunately, we're sort of trending towards the worst case scenario for conventional building, where rightly so, there's been a drive to make buildings more energy efficient. So where code has been really successful in intervening in terms of ideally lowering the sort of resource intensity and carbon footprint of buildings is on the operational side. So the building codes in Canada have made huge strides in making buildings more energy efficient, to the point where like the current iteration is what we would have called high performance 5 years ago is what's sort of required by code now. So we've done a really good job at that, but unfortunately the way people are reaching that level of energy efficiency is really through the application of a lot of foam-based insulation, which of all the things that I've studied has both the highest carbon footprint and the highest toxical chemical loading and the highest issues around sort of like management on site and waste issues on site, and then waste issues at the end of the life of the building. Like those materials kind of carry the worst of all of those implications. So we are able to make these energy efficient buildings, but we're doing it in a way that sort of negates the carbon benefits of having a more energy efficient building and creates this sort of trail of toxic chemicals and wastes and future disposal issues. So that, that's one way that the building world is going, and it's sort of the worst scenario for climate change and for human health and ecological health. The sort of alternative to that is, and the sort of the great sort of like carbon neutral building that's possible off the shelf is a move to using more cellulose insulation, of which there's lots around. Here in Ontario, I think we have 6 manufacturers of cellulose. So it's a great business in that it tends to be small and local and independently owned and distributed bioregionally instead of coming from centralized factories. It's taking a waste stream material and giving it second life. It's carbon storing. It tends to be the flame suppressants in it are borax. So while there are some issues with that, like nowhere near the kind of issues with some of the chemical treatments in other insulations. So a simple switch to cellulose insulation makes a huge difference. A move to wood fiberboard sheathing rather than foam sheathing on the outside of buildings. Similarly, it's coming from the waste wood stream and low in toxicity, low in waste issues, all that kind of stuff, and carbon storing. Simple things like FSC certified wood flooring versus vinyl flooring. Like there are all kinds of decisions that a builder could make, but in the modeling that I'm doing, quite literally the switch to cellulose insulation and wood fiberboard exterior makes a massive difference. Takes a building that was a huge embodied carbon emitter and turning it into something that, if not a storer, at least pretty close to being neutral. And then the other decision that a builder can make quite easily now is specifying concrete mixes that have lots of supplementary cementitious material in it. So these are waste materials from other industrial streams that can kind of displace the amount of Portland cement in a mix. So if you're specifying, say, a 40 to 50% slag content in your concrete, that's knocking about a third off the carbon footprint of that concrete. So there are great ways to use no concrete in a building, but that's a bigger leap for the whole industry to make. But in the meantime, you can just leap to knocking a third off the footprint, which makes a huge difference. And that's just in what you tell the concrete company when you specify the mix. So it's not, again, there's no big sort of like risk or difference in sort of order of operations for a builder to do that. It's just making the choice to specify that kind of concrete. I mean, the dream carbon sink building is to just figure out how to use more plant material than we currently do. And so if you look at the carbon footprint of a typical residential building in this part of the world right now, most of it is sunk into the concrete basement foundation. So a bigger leap for the conventional building world would be to say that we can't ecologically keep building basements under all these houses. Like the carbon footprint of doing that, you can bring it down to a certain amount, but it's going to be very hard to eliminate. So a change to the dream carbon storing building would be use as little material in the ground as possible and bring everything up out of the ground. So, working with simple pier type foundations. So if they're concrete, you're now using, 16 concrete tubes instead of a continuous wall. Screw pier foundations. There are all kinds of sort of innovative pier foundation options. And then once you bring the floor up out of the ground, now you can insulate that whole floor area with cellulose or straw or hemp or, whatever, mycofoam, whatever sort of plant-based insulation comes along. So you've now displaced all that concrete and typically all the foam insulation that you put in the ground, because you can't put plants in the ground. You bring it up and now the floor becomes a big storage area too. And in terms of the walls and the attic insulation, in terms of carbon storage per inch of R value, grain straw is the best thing that I've come across so far. So whether it's like in bale form or shredded straw, it has the lowest embodied inputs to make the material for the highest amount of storage for the most affordable cost, and the best sort of like R value per inch of those range of materials. So and I think we haven't even started to scratch the surface of all the materials that could fit that thing. Like right now we're using a lot of grain straw from industrial agriculture, but I drive along the highway and see all those Phragmites that grow 10 feet tall in a year, and they're the same fiber. Like, if we could be harvesting the side of every highway and insulating half the houses in the province by shredding up that material. So I think, and there are just so many opportunities for looking at biomass that currently isn't being used and figuring out how to turn it into insulation. And the technology to turn it into insulation is simple. The cellulose industry's already nailed how you shred this stuff and pack it and move it around and blow it into walls. So it's really just so yeah, the great carbon storing house would have relatively thick walls of that kind of insulation, a good layer of that in the attic. I think it's further fetched in North America, but a thatched roof is incredible. Like the model house that I'm working on right now, if you do a really great job of making a carbon storing house, is a 2,000 square foot house. I could design one that stores a lot of carbon and you can get it into about the sort of like 20 tons of storage range. A thatched roof alone is about 15 tons. So you can, almost double the amount of carbon storage by starting to think about, that type of roofing, which is obviously less likely to, make the leap to conventional practice. But if we really want to, nail this carbon thing, like it's a technology that's been around a long time. People know how to do it. There are standards and professionals that, especially coming from Europe, there's a whole pool of knowledge that would allow us to make a transition like that. But that seems further fetched. But the ideal dream carbon storage house would also have a thatched roof.
Nice.
Thought a lot about how to think about materials and how to help people think about materials, because it is really overwhelming if you sort of dip your toe into researching about this stuff. First of all, the first thing you find is that everybody's idea is like the best, most awesome, most infallible, like the only way to do it. And I definitely, I think one of the important things is, there is no silver bullet and there is no one right answer. And as important as thinking about what are the things about a particular material choice that really suit your needs, is also looking at what are the inevitable drawbacks of that particular material and making sure that those drawbacks are most closely aligned to your goals versus the great things. Because, for the most part, most great materials have very similar benefits in a lot of ways. And so it's more, what is the drawback to that material and how much of a drawback is that to you personally? So, quite often that comes down to cost. Here's a material, it's wonderful, it's 3 times what I was thinking of spending. So, that might be a limitation to that material that you puts it out of your range. So when I was, so I did this book, Making Better Buildings, and the whole idea of that book, because I'd been trying to answer people's material questions for so long, we had kind of at Endeavour developed a criteria matrix, like, what are the different lenses that you would look at these systems through? So cost being one, code compliance being one, toxicity, sort of human health effects being one, embodied energy efficiency. So we sort of had this matrix of about 10 different criteria. And so the notion with the Making Better Buildings book was, let's go through all of these materials and sort of plot them, how they stack up on those criteria, so that rather than a builder or a designer trying to pick a material, they pick the importance of their criteria and then go to the book and find like which materials meet those criteria. So kind of having the goal drive the decision rather than the material drive the decision. And it was in doing that book that I really discovered the embodied carbon notion, because in looking at, okay, what are the sort of practical numbers that I can find to attach to all these materials to compare them, I found a database of carbon footprint, and I thought, oh, that's another interesting lens to add to that. And so yeah, the book sort of rates all of these materials on things like their carbon footprint, their cost. I think importantly for housing, especially for owner builders, is like, what's the skill level required to deal with this particular material? So you might have something that has all these great benefits, but you don't have the skills necessarily to be able to do it, or attaining the skills is going to be difficult, or the time invested in attaining the skill isn't going to be practical in your project. So that was the notion of that book, is to sort of look at what are all the sustainable options that somebody might be able to acquire, and sort of really rate them as well as we could, not as this one is better than this one, but this one is lower cost than this one, but it has code implications, or so that people could actually try to balance out what their needs were and sort of find the material that met those needs, not by a gut reaction to, oh, I really like straw bale, or I'm really aligned with hempcrete or something like that, but to figure out, like, is that actually the right choice, given what you're trying to achieve with this particular building. I feel like in some ways my whole career is about myth busting in a lot of ways. One of my favorite ones being in North America we have zero use for or adoption of using earth as a building material, despite the fact that historically and globally it's the building material of choice, and historically has been the building material of choice. And my favorite pathway to sort of busting that myth of earth as not an appropriate building material is, especially with building officials, but if you look at the building code, the underlying principle of every building is that it sits on undisturbed soil. Like that's the language in the building. So in other words, every builder, whether they're an earth builder or a conventional builder, is building on a rammed earth foundation. The rammed earth being the soil underneath us that, if you don't disturb it, is compact and strong enough to put every building that we currently function in is a rammed earth building. It's just, so now when you think, oh, could I use rammed earth? Now you're just thinking about taking this thing that we already build with and bring it up the assembly. Like, so could you use rammed earth in a foundation? Sure. Can you use rammed earth in walls? Sure. So but the notion is proven because we're sitting in a building that's sitting on a rammed earth foundation. So I love, that as a myth bust, that like we do build with rammed earth. Every builder is a rammed earth builder, whether they know it or not. And I think how the code thinks about materials really reflects how the people, responsible for code, which is kind of all of us, think about materials, which is to really focus on what are the potential flaws of that material, and so we're really good at focusing on the potential flaws of things that are new to us. Like, here comes an idea, building with straw, right away. Does it burn? Does it rot? There are all these things that rightly so, come to mind, and that we think, oh, maybe this is a potential downfall. But if we put that same level of thinking into the things that we're used to using, so wood framing, like, there is no way you would be able to introduce, 2x4s as a building material now into our current code climate if nobody had used them already, because a building official would look at it and go, that stuff, it burns easily, it rots easily, insects eat it, it cracks, like, how it performs depends on how dry it is, how wet it is, when it was milled, out of what kind of tree it was milled. Like, it has all of these flaws, but what we've done is say, well, it's got these great attributes. It's easy to cut, it's easy to fasten, it grows everywhere. So we figured out how to take the good parts of wood and manage those drawbacks, but we just think of that as normal. Like, we don't think of wood as a risky material, but it's an extremely risky material. We've just managed that risk really well. And so I think most of the things that sort of live in the alternative building realm are exactly the same. Like, they have these great benefits, and the risks that they bring are completely manageable, if we just sort of like apply some really basic thinking about how to manage risk. And we've done that with, concrete buildings, wood buildings, stone buildings, everything that we're sort of used to as conventional buildings, all has inherent risk that we figured out how to manage. And a lot of this, the sustainable or alternative materials actually have less real risks, but more perceived risks than the things that we're used to. I think I'm sort of half optimistic about all of this stuff and half pessimistic, because I do see the building industry going in a direction that is kind of like counter to what we really need to be doing, that we're using more embodied energy and carbon in the materials, we're putting more potentially dangerous chemicals into the materials, and creating more materials that we don't know what to do with when the building, is either changed or at the end of its life. So yeah, I'm discouraged by that, but I'm encouraged by the fact that there is so much, work going on around making carbon storing materials, around making buildings more energy efficient, and in particular around the sort of health concerns. I think that's for a lot of people in the building regulation world, the health risks are becoming real. Like that's sort of the next level of risk that that codes and in particular manufacturers see. Unfortunately, that's kind of driven by lawsuits and the potential reactions of the market to having a cancer caused by a building material in your house, or having illnesses caused by VOC emissions in the house. But regardless of why that's coming about, I think the interest in are the spaces we're building actually good places for people to be is starting to move in a really positive direction. So I feel like there's strong interest and building momentum going in the right direction, but also like the big ship of the industry is kind of going in the opposite direction. Hopefully the sort of pull in this way is enough to kind of try to drag the whole ship around and bring the whole industry along. People can find out more by going to the Endeavour website, which is endeavourcentre.org. We're the series editors for the Sustainable Building Essentials series. So at New Society Press has a whole series of books that we've helped curate on all of these different topics.